Mr. Ramsay had almost done reading. One hand hovered over the page as if to be in readiness to turn it the very instant he had finished it. He sat there bareheaded with the wind blowing his hair about, extraordinarily exposed to everything. He looked very old. He looked, James thought, getting his head now against the lighthouse, now against the waste of waters, running away into the open like some old stone lying on the sand. He looked as if he had become physically what was always at the back of both of their minds. That loneliness which was for both of them the truth about things. He was reading very quickly as if he were eager to get to the end. Indeed, they were very close to the lighthouse now. There it loomed up, stark and straight, glaring white and black, and one could see the waves breaking in white splinters like smashed glass upon the rocks. One could see lines and creases in the rocks. One could see the windows clearly, a dab of white on one of them, and a little tuft of green on the rock. A man had come out and looked at them through a glass and gone in again. So it was like that, James thought, the lighthouse one had seen across the bay all these years. It was a stark tower on a bare rock. It satisfied him. It confirmed some obscure feeling of his about his own character. The old ladies, he thought, thinking of the garden at home, went dragging their chairs about on the lawn. Old Mrs. Beckwith, for example, was always saying how nice it was and how sweet it was and how they ought to be so proud and they ought to be so happy. But as a matter of fact, James thought, looking at the lighthouse, stood there on its rock. It's like that. He looked at his father reading fiercely with his legs curled tight. They shared that knowledge. We are driving before a gale. We must sink, he began saying to himself, half aloud, exactly as his father had said it. Nobody seemed to have spoken for an age. Cam was tired of looking at the sea. Little bits of black cork had floated past. The fish were dead in the bottom of the boat. Still her father read, and James looked at him, and she looked at him, and they vowed that they would fight tyranny to the death, and he went on reading, quite unconscious of what they thought. It was thus that he escaped, she thought. Yes, with his great forehead and his great nose. Holding his little mottled book firmly in front of him, he escaped. You might try to lay hands on him, but then like a bird, he spread his wings. He floated off to settle out of your reach somewhere far away on some desolate stump. She gazed at the immense expanse of the sea. The island had grown so small that it scarcely looked like a leaf any longer. It looked like the top of a rock which some wave bigger than the rest would cover, yet in its frailty were all those paths, those terraces, those bedrooms, all those innumerable things. But as just before sleep, things simplify themselves so that only one of all the myriad details has power to assert itself, so she felt, looking drowsily at the island, all those paths and terraces and bedrooms were fading and disappearing, and nothing was left but a pale blue censer swinging rhythmically this way and that across her mind. It was a hanging garden. It was a valley full of birds and flowers and antelopes. She was falling asleep. Come now, said Mr. Ramsay, suddenly shutting his book. Come where? To what extraordinary adventure? She woke with a start. To land somewhere? To climb somewhere? Where was he leading them? For after his immense silence, the words startled them. But it was absurd. He was hungry, he said. It was time for lunch. Besides, look, he said. There's the lighthouse. We're almost there. He's doing very well, said McAllister, praising James. He's keeping her very steady. But his father never praised him, James thought grimly. Mr. Ramsay opened the parcel and shared out the sandwiches among them. Now he was happy eating bread and cheese with these fishermen. He would have liked to live in a cottage and lounge about in the harbor, spitting with the other old men, James thought, watching him slice his cheese into thin yellow sheets with his penknife. This is right. This is it. Cam kept feeling as she peeled her hard-boiled egg. Now she felt as she did in the study when the old men were reading the Times. Now I can go on thinking whatever I like, and I shan't fall over a precipice or be drowned. For there he is, keeping his eye on me, she thought. At the same time, they were sailing so fast along by the rocks that it was very exciting. It seemed as if they were doing two things at once. They were eating their lunch here in the sun, and they were also making for safety in a great storm after a shipwreck. Would the water last? Would the provisions last? She asked herself, telling herself a story, but knowing at the same time what was the truth. They would soon be out of it, Mr. Ramsay was saying to old McAllister, but their children would see some strange things. McAllister said he was 75 last March. Mr. Ramsay was 71. McAllister said he had never seen a doctor. He had never lost a tooth. And that's the way I'd like my children to live. Cam was sure that her father was thinking that, for he stopped her throwing a sandwich into the sea and told her, as if he were thinking of the fishermen and how they lived, that if she did not want it, she could put it back in the parcel. She should not waste it. He said it so wisely, as if he knew so well all the things that happened in the world, that she put it back at once. And then he gave her, from his own parcel, a gingerbread nut, as if he were a great Spanish gentleman, she thought, handing a flower to a lady at a window, so courteous his manner was. He was shabby and simple, eating bread and cheese, and yet he was leading them on a great expedition where, for all she knew, they would be drowned. That was where she sunk, said McAllister's boy suddenly. 3 men were drowned where we are now, the old man said. He had seen them clinging to the mast himself, and Mr. Ramsay, taking a look at the spot, was about. James and Cam were afraid to burst out, but I beneath a rougher sea. And if he did, they could not bear it. They would shriek aloud. They could not endure another explosion of the passion that boiled in him. But to their surprise, all he said was, "Ah," as if he thought to himself, but why make a fuss about that? Naturally, men are drowned in a storm. But it is a perfectly straightforward affair. In the depths of the sea, he sprinkled the crumbs from his sandwich paper over them, are only water after all. Then, having lighted his pipe, he took out his watch. He looked at it attentively. He made perhaps some mathematical calculation. At last he said triumphantly, "Well done." James had steered them like a born sailor. There, Cam thought, addressing herself silently to James, you've got it at last, for she knew that this was what James had been wanting, and she knew that now he had got it. He was so pleased that he would not look at her or at his father or at anyone. There he sat with his hand on the tiller, sitting bolt upright, looking rather sulky and frowning slightly. He was so pleased that he was not going to let anybody share a grain of his pleasure. His father had praised him. They must think that he was perfectly indifferent. But you've got it now, Cam thought. They had tacked, and they were sailing swiftly, buoyantly on long rocking waves, which handed them on from one to another with an extraordinary lilt and exhilaration beside the reef. On the left, a row of rocks showed brown through the water, which thinned and became greener, and on one, a higher rock, a wave incessantly broke and spurted a little column of drops, which fell down in a shower. One could hear the slap of the water and the patter of falling drops, and a kind of hushing and hissing sound from the waves, rolling and gambolling and slapping the rocks as if they were wild creatures who were perfectly free and tossed and tumbled and sported like this forever. Shit. Now they could see 2 men on the lighthouse watching them and making ready to meet them. Mr. Ramsay buttoned his coat and turned up his trousers. He took the large, badly packed brown paper parcel which Nancy had got ready and sat with it on his knee. Thus, in complete readiness to land, he sat looking back at the island. With his long-sighted eyes, perhaps he could see the dwindled leaf-like shape standing on end on a plate of gold quite clearly. One could hear the slap of the water and the patter of falling drops and a kind of hushing and hissing sound from the waves rolling and gamboling and slapping the rocks as if they were wild creatures who were perfectly free and tossed and tumbled and sported like this forever. Now they could see two men on the lighthouse watching them and making ready to meet them. Mr. Ramsay buttoned his coat and turned up his trousers. He took the large, badly packed brown paper parcel which Nancy had got ready and sat with it on his knee. Thus, in complete readiness to land, he sat looking back at the island. With his long-sighted eyes, perhaps he could see the dwindled leaf-like shape standing on end on a plate of gold quite clearly. What could he see, Cam wondered. It was all a blur to her. What was he thinking now, she wondered. What was it he sought so fixedly, so intently, so silently? They watched him, both of them, sitting bareheaded with his parcel on his knee, staring and staring at the frail blue shape, which seemed like the vapor of something that had burnt itself away. What do you want? They both wanted to ask. They both wanted to say, ask us anything and we will give it to you. But he did not ask them anything. He sat and looked at the island, and he might be thinking, we perished each alone, or he might be thinking, I have reached it, I have found it, but he said nothing. Then he put on his hat. Bring those parcels, he said, nodding his head at the things Nancy had done up for them to take to the lighthouse. The parcels for the lighthouse men, he said. He rose and stood in the bow of the boat, very straight and tall for all the world. James thought as if he were saying, there is no God, and Cam thought as if he were leaping into space, and they both rose to follow him as he sprang lightly like a young man, holding his parcel on the rock, onto the rock. He must have reached it, said Lily Briscoe aloud, feeling suddenly completely tired out. For the lighthouse had become almost invisible, had melted away into a blue haze, and the effort of looking at it and the effort of thinking of him landing there, which both seemed to be one and the same effort, had stretched her body and mind to the utmost. Ah, but she was relieved. Whatever she had wanted to give him when he left her that morning, she had given him at last. He has landed, she said aloud. It is finished. Then, surging up, puffing slightly, old Mr. Carmichael stood beside her, looking like an old pagan god, shaggy with weeds in his hair, and the trident, it was only a French novel, in his hand. He stood by her on the edge of the lawn, swaying a little in his bulk, and said, shading his eyes with his hand, they will have landed, and she felt that she had been right. They had not needed to speak. They had been thinking the same things, and he had answered her without her asking him anything. He stood there as if he were spreading his hands over all the weaknesses and suffering of mankind. She thought he was surveying tolerantly and compassionately their final destiny. Now he has crowned the occasion, she thought, when his hand slowly fell, as if she had seen him let fall from his great height a wreath of violets and asphodels which, fluttering slowly, lay at length upon the earth. Quickly, as if she were recalled by something over there, she returned to her canvas. There it was, her picture. Yes, with all its greens and blues, its lines running up and across, its attempt at something. It would be hung in the attics, she thought. It would be destroyed, but what did that matter, she asked herself, taking up her brush again. She looked at the steps, they were empty. She looked at her canvas, it was blurred. With a sudden intensity, as if she saw it clear for a second, she drew a line there in the center. It was done, it was finished. Yes, she thought, laying down her brush in extreme fatigue, I have had my vision.